This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene. And we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics to two guys who basically have written a PhD thesis on Nancy.
That's right. And those people that Gene was referring to are Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden. We talk with them about their book, How to Read Nancy, The Elements of Comics in 3 Easy Panels, and we have a really insightful conversation. But before we get to that, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you can find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, and if you like what you hear in this interview today, our sponsor, DCB Service, also has How to Read Nancy for your purchasing pleasure at 35% off.
That's right. So you pay only $19.49 on dcbservice.com, and the book is worth way more than that because it's chocked full of useful, insightful, contextual information.
Yeah, I wasn't exactly joking when I said they've basically written a PhD thesis on Nancy. The only thing that I said wrong there was that it's a PhD thesis on Nancy in context. You learn so much about the history of comics as well as the nuts and bolts of how the medium itself works. You learn a lot from this book, and you'll hear that in the interview to follow.
That's right. So you can get your copy of How to Read Nancy at dcbservice.com or a variety of other comics at great discounts. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Ching.
Gene, this was a really fun conversation with Paul and Mark.
Yeah, they've again. I knew the original essay that this book is based on for a long time, and I was excited to hear when it was announced that it was going to become a book. And then it was a long wait, but the wait is totally worth it. And I think you'll hear that in the interview itself. Just what a rich book this actually is, and it was worth all that wait.
Yes, and all that work that they put into it.
It's all the work that they put into it shows on the page, on the many pages. It's fun to read. It's fun to look at, as they say, because it's really well illustrated, and they talk about kind of their ideas on what they wanted to show you and how they wanted to show you images on the page, and that itself is worth the price of admission alone. Even disregarding the text, the images themselves, what they choose to show us, is a treasure trove, and then the work they've done to put all those images in context makes this a really, really useful book.
Yes. Now, this came out back in November of last year from Fantagraphics, and we had wanted to have Paul and Mark on the show sooner than now, but trying to coordinate something with their schedule and then with our schedules was a little more challenging than we thought. But also, I think it kind of worked to our benefit because we were able to talk with Mark and Paul not only about their book, but also the reception of their book, at least from their perspective, what they've done to publicize the book, the lectures or the classes that they've given since then. So that was, I found, informative as well.
Yeah, definitely. So we should probably jump in and take a listen to it.
Yeah, let's. We're pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden. Their latest work, How to Read Nancy, The Elements of Comics in 3 Easy Panels, came out last fall from Fantagraphics. Mark, Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, Derek. Great to be here.
Thanks a lot for being here, guys.
This reads like a book that was a long time in coming. And when I say that, I don't mean that it's about time that someone do this kind of close reading of Bushmiller's Nancy. But, I mean, from your introduction, from the setup, you make it clear that this is a strip, this particular strip from 1959 is one that the two of you have been working on for quite some time.
Yeah. The original version of the essay was way back in 1988. And that probably took us a month.
And we thought we were done with Nancy and Bushmiller. But what happened was that essay appeared in an important book, a collection of Bushmiller Nancy strips edited by Brian Walker. And they got used and photocopied quite a bit over the years. And when people were starting to teach about comics classes, they started teaching using it as easy-to-use text. Subsequently, Mark and I have both taught the strip extensively over the years. We both teach comics classes, and the more we would project this strip on the screen, the more we realized there was lots more to talk about than the few examples that we gave in the original essay.
Now, how long was the original essay?
The original essay isolated 9 aspects of comics language, and the book is 43, 44.
Yeah, it's a little fudge depending on your definition of aspects. But we returned to it as a whole strip, I think, on the 43rd.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I remember when the first essay came out. Well, not immediately, because I probably didn't see it because it was 1988. I didn't see it probably till like 92 or 93. And it was, I hadn't quite been converted to Bushmillerism yet. And I was like, man, that's a lot of work for Nancy. I appreciated it, but I was like, I still wasn't quite sure. I wasn't ready to say, yeah, give me more of this. But the longer I studied comics, I would do similar things in my classrooms as well. And when I heard that you guys did the announcement 4 or 5 years ago or so-ish that you guys were going to turn it into a book, I was really excited. And I know that was a long journey getting from that original 8-page essay to this incredibly, incredibly detailed book.
And oddly enough, we're just prior to coming on with you guys, we're sitting here thinking about 4 other things we left out and need to add in the next edition. This is clearly a mental illness that could go on well into the next century.
And interestingly enough, you referenced Freud a few times in the text.
Well, yeah. It's our own private analysis. And it ended up with us both probably needing to go into analysis.
What I was going to say, the cliche question to this interview is why Nancy, but I want to say why Nancy again. And you sort of start, and you've pretty much answered that. You've been sticking with it the whole time. Is it as if you've never found anything that's more concise to talk about, to tear apart, or is it just that this is so incredibly rich that there's no need to look anywhere else?
We really kind of lucked out with this strip, which was chosen fairly randomly, actually very randomly. The reason we did this strip originally is Paul had a copy of the early 1960s Nancy paperback, and this was a loose page. We decided this would be a good one on that basis, pretty much. But
that's fantastic.
The original essay has been, used in comic studies all over the world, and it just kind of never dies. And we get constant requests for PDFs, and it was clearly not going away. So it never occurred to us to look at anything else except look more at this.
So then about 10 years ago, we looked at each other and said, well, it's time for a book. Let's take this a little further and see if we can, create a book. And Fantagraphics was interested. And so, okay, we sat down. We figured, okay, this will be, we'll give it a year or two of work. And then that turned into 3 or 4 years, 5 or 6. It took 10 years to finish this project. And it almost finished us.
On several occasions, yes.
Now, the gist of your manuscript, this book that came out last fall, is centered on this strip that originally appeared in newspapers on August 8th, 1959. And for those who may not be familiar with this is, of course, a 3-panel strip where you have, in the first panel, Nancy observing Sluggo squirting a little girl with a water gun and saying, "Draw, you varmint." In the second panel, sans Nancy observing things, we see Sluggo squirting a little boy saying, "Draw, you varmint." And then in the third and longest, in terms of width, panel, we see Sluggo approaching Nancy, whose face we cannot see, standing next to a fence with a hose in her holster, but Sluggo cannot see the hose because of the fence. And as he approaches her, he is saying, "Draw, you varmint." And from that simple strip, you give us an elaborate reading, well over 40 individual steps from about 12 or 13 different perspectives. And that's the core of the text. But you also begin the book, or almost begin the book, with a highly detailed biography of Bushmiller.
Yeah, I before we go further, I just want to compliment you on your reading there, Derek. Your close reading of that strip. That was pretty good.
Well, I have audio listeners in mind, so we're not a visual medium unlike Nancy.
You're channeling FDR. Was it LaGuardia?
LaGuardia.
Well, thank you.
Good work. But still, you got to, it's best seen.
Oh, yes. But I wanted to give our listeners some kind of context, because I'm sure we'll get to some of the details of your close reading of the strip. And by the way, one of the things that, you mentioned this at the outset, but I really do appreciate that you actualize this, is that you really do ground your interpretations in ways that many critical readers, academics, critics, otherwise, may not do. In other words, there's really not that much abstraction going on in your analysis, because you're able to take things and not only ground it in the strip itself, but also in ways that are very understandable to both sophisticated and also even more casual readers, I think, would appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, the genesis of this project was Brian Walker's book, but we were also teaching together at the time that we did this, and it had a really practical application to the class we were teaching. We were cartoonists talking to other cartoonists, and we do try to keep it grounded in that background of, the reality of how a comic strip gets on a page.
And hence, both of us root our teaching in discussions about the observable. There's no need to extrapolate when you're looking critically at work. If you stick with the observable in a visual medium, you're going to hit the nuggets. And actually, the closer that you stick to the observable, the more visible the nuggets become. So, tip for teachers, when the students are putting their work on the wall, don't talk about whether it's cool or whether you like it. Talk about what you see.
Yeah, and that struck me so much with this book, not just what you do, but even the content, how it's laid out, and that it's all about close reading. I actually flagged one of the things in the preamble to the book. Critical thinking is taught at the college level, but critical perceiving must come first, and that really, really resonated with me. Just to go off on a slight personal tangent, when I was a graduate student, I was doing a lot of kind of formalist criticism of comics myself, and I had some people say, but that's a dead end. You should need to be talking about the social ramifications or political aspects and things like this. And I was like, but I've read a lot of articles that do that, but they treat the comic as something that is purely understandable, and it becomes an occasion to talk about something else. I want to talk about the thing that's there on the page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful, wonderful statement. I agree with that 100%. I think that it's easy to get derailed, just to go back into the classroom again. It's easy to get derailed, but it's about perception. I don't think many of my students, I know, I've been teaching for, 15, 20 years. I know that a lot of my students aren't going to go out and become cartoonists, but when they leave my classroom, they're going to be better consumers because they are more perceptive. I'm teaching them about perception. If they become cartoonists, great, swell.
It sounds similar to the way I would approach the film courses, like the intro to film courses that I used to teach. And that is, I would always tell my students the first day of class, how many of you enjoy movies? And of course, everyone would raise their hand. And then I would say, okay, my promise to you this semester is that I'm going to ruin movie watching for you. Because we're going to look at how everything works together to create some kind of meaning or appreciation. And by seeing all the moving parts, in other words, in pulling back the curtain to show the kind of scaffolding that goes in to your enjoyment of a film, you're going to notice this stuff when you go out to see a movie and then enjoy it, but I hope in a good way and not in a regretful way.
I mean, you're ruining one way for them watching movies, but you're in fact increasing their, deepening their appreciation for the craft of movie making, and hence they're going to be able to tell good movies from bad movies more perceptively.
Mm-hmm. One of the direct impetuses for this project came from, I don't even know there was a class. It was more of a sort of series of screenings that experimental filmmaker named Ken Jacobs held in Manhattan, where he took Frank Capra's Meet John Doe and presented it frame by frame over, 2 months. Yeah.
Wow.
And, lectured accordingly. That kind of blew our minds.
Yep.
And I think it really kind of led to us thinking about comics in the same way.
Yeah, I'd say that experience, and that, for me, that Hitchcock Truffaut book, like that thing's barely held together on my bookshelf. That was, both of those experiences tremendously informative. How to elicit an intellectual and emotional response by manipulating all the elements at your disposal, using all the tricks that are in your toolbox with intention. And that's what Bushmiller did.
Utilizing all the tools in your toolbox with intention. That really seems to be the core of the way you describe what he does. It's always, you got to gag it up.
You got to do the job right.
Yeah. and that means only the things that are absolutely necessary to do the job.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
So what, Mark, were you channeling Bushmiller right there?
Yeah, that's evidently something that he would bark into the phone in the later years of his life to some of his assistants when he was sort of early onset Parkinson's and couldn't do a lot of the rendering himself. Literally made life torture for a cartoonist named Al Plastino, who was drawing the Sunday strips in the very last days of Bushmiller's Nancy.
Well, we've got... when we make a public appearance, we show this little clip of Bushmiller as a shill for war bonds. And the sound of his voice, that he doesn't say more than a few lines, but that Bronx kind of, he's trying hard not to snarl too much as he's trying to convince you to buy war bonds. But Mark did a pretty good imitation right there.
Well, what are some of the things that you learned, not so much about the comics, but the man behind the comics in researching and preparing for turning the essay into the book?
We learned as much as we possibly could. We made it our goal to try to be in touch with anybody left who was familiar with him, spent time with him, even had a simple casual conversation with him. We were tremendously indebted to James Carlson, who was a family friend and had been Bushmiller's assistant from a fairly early age, neighbor in Stamford, Connecticut. And Also, we spoke to Al Plastino, who again worked on Nancy in Bushmiller's last days. And I feel like we kind of just hit a few other cartoonists just at the very right time. That each one who had a good nugget for us. Yeah.
Was there anything that you were surprised by when you, as you kind of got into the biography?
I'd say one of the things that surprised me overall was his dedication to his craft. You know, I didn't really know that too much about him when we started researching him, and I thought, oh, he's just one of those Stanford cartoonists. You know, these guys who sort of punch the clock, but hardworking. You know, putting out the product 7 days a week, but. You know, there's lots of afternoons with the golf, and there's a scotch at 5 o'clock, and thinking about. Now, Bushmiller was a seriously dedicated cartoonist. I'm not saying these other guys weren't seriously dedicated, but Bushmiller lived for his profession. He when he was a kid, he dropped out of school so that he could work in the art department at the New York World. And he clearly was interested as an early teenager to become a cartoonist. He set his goal and he attained it.
Yeah, I was gonna say I liked your description of his studio. He had 4 different drawing boards up at the same time, 4 or 5 at the same time. So he could, when the ink is drying on one, he could be working on another, and he would bounce back and forth between strips.
Yeah, that was something that surprised us too, but we got it pretty straight from the horse's mouth. It was Jim who was often buying Ernie's tools for him and running errands just around that time. So he was working in a sort of modular fashion. I probably to keep himself interested, because I think he had already done the skeletal version of these strips and sort of was so precise about where he needed to be that he had to kind of like mix it up and make a little bit more fun for himself when it came to the actual rendering.
Yeah, I sort of also have this fantasy, you know, it's not based on anything that we know for sure, that when you start doing something, it's good to take a little step back from it for a night or a day. You know, and whenever, I know this is true with Mark and myself, when we're writing something, if we get to a place where a sequence has been overwrought, put it in a drawer for a few days, and come back to it. I sort of have this fantasy about Bushmiller too, with these drawings about around the desk, as Mark was saying, really concisely fine tuning them and taking them. Okay, I've done enough work on Tuesday's strip. I'm going to work on Wednesday's strip, then Thursday's strip. By the time he gets back to Tuesday's strip again, maybe it's a day or two later, and he can see, oh, wait a second. Nancy's bow needs to be a 1/16 of an inch to the left. I mean, I'm not kidding.
Well, Jim did tell us that he would take a full week's worth of strips that he had completed and just sort of put them up on the wall and look at them and start cutting words. If there was any extra words that would slow down the strip for a split second, he would redo it.
Wow.
He wrote his captions like somebody writing telegraphs, where you're literally paying by the character.
And you said that at one point he was like 365 days ahead?
That's the story we heard, yeah.
Good Lord.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Well, when you're not doing a topical or a political strip, you're doing something that's sort of ageless. Well, Christmas is going to be on a certain date, and there might be a good Easter egg joke around this time of year. But, day in and day out, the year in and year out, the life in the backyard of Nancy and Sluggo stays fairly consistent. It's one of its charms.
Yeah, and I think he also sort of thought about it as money in the bank, that he had, money in the bank. He had a full year in reserve, and he could breathe a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things, though, that you guys point out is that while on the one hand there does seem to be kind of a timelessness with the Nancy strip, on the other hand, Bushmiller wittingly or maybe unwittingly participated in certain, I guess, temporally anchored phenomena. In particular, I'm thinking of the Westerns that were prominent on television at around the time that this particular strip in 1959, around the time that it came out. And you point out several times that this was the most popular genre on television. And it lasted that way into the 1960s. Although, I mean, really, Bushmiller had no way of knowing how popular Westerns were going to be for how long. But I think that they had taken such a hold on our culture that, got even into our childhood when you didn't have near as many Westerns on television. You nonetheless played cowboys and Indians, right? You had the guns, the holsters, the sheriff's badge and whatnot. So it was a phenomena that resonated beyond the life of the television genre. And this is something that Bushmiller worked in quite effectively into Nancy as a whole, but in particular this strip.
Yeah, and if you even look at his own lifetime, he grew up in an era where the same sort of stories were being peddled in dime novels, later on radio and motion pictures, obviously, and into the TV era. It's really just a precept of 20th century childhood was that sort of the Western myth.
I'm wondering what young readers would think of the word varmint.
I have to explain it. Often I have to explain it to my students, especially some of my English as second language students. Varmint is it's a very odd word. I say rodent or pest, and then they get it. And everyone still pretty much knows what a Western is.
Yeah, but a little bit of the lingo maybe doesn't age as well as the drawings themselves. I wanted to talk about Derek. You gave us a good idea of what the strip is like. I want to talk a little bit about what the meat of the book is like, because we've said a few times that you've gone through like 43 different iterations of the strip, or 44 different iterations of the strip, and you talk about different things in each one. And just for our readers, the way the heart of the book is set up, we've got that strip that runs across the top of every 2-page spread. And you'll highlight different things in each strip. And by highlight, I mean you erase everything that isn't about what you're talking about. And then we've got, and it's broken down into different categories. You've got the script, the cast, the props and special effects, lots of different categories like that. But we're always seeing the strip right above it. And underneath, on the left-hand side of the page, we begin with a context where you talk about ideas, cultural ideas, artistic ideas, cartooning ideas, even other ideas in Nancy itself, to the context of whatever the things you're trying to focus on at that particular moment. And then usually the right-hand side of the page, sometimes the left creeps over, but then we've got text. And so then that's where you're doing the actual close reading of exactly what's happening, of exactly the thing that you're highlighting in the image above, and we end with a moral. This is a really highly structured way of going through, which I really, really appreciated. I was wondering how did you come up with this kind of a rigorous approach? Because the original essay is not nearly so highly structured as what the book itself becomes.
Well, we found ourselves just awash in information because, as I said, Mark and I both have been teaching this strip for so long that we'd start. I think. The way that context text thing came about, and basically speaking, has to do with we just had so much material that we'd find we'd be writing and writing and writing, and maybe the lesson itself was getting a little sidetracked or a little lost because we had so much to say about a specific subject, like, say, balloon placement, and wanting to talk about balloons and the history of balloons in comic strips. And and then, so by separating the historical lesson or the contemporary context on one side and the text on the other, it just becomes so much more user-friendly. We really wanted this book to be fun and useful for beginning cartoonists, seasoned cartoonists, and teachers. People are teaching comics now. Mark and I have been teaching comics classes for years, but now lots of universities are teaching us, and we wanted to make a book that would be fun for teachers to teach and for students to use and would actually be useful.
You're talking about all the information that you had that spills over into the appendices. And in addition to what Gene was describing, we have a variety of appendices at the end of the book, which allows you much more space to provide a variety of different contexts. And I appreciated those. My favorite, I have to say, is appendix number 6, which you title, "Hey, where have I seen that gag before?" And you give us a variety of comic art or illustration art that uses the gag of the hose and how that has been used in a variety of different ways. But you begin that appendix by referencing Lumiere's The Hoser Hosed, which I appreciated very much. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I think that ate up a year of our life right there easily.
a year plus. We worked really hard on this book, but we got a lot of help from scholars and fans and enthusiasts of cartooning. And especially with that particular appendix, there are people who are already interested in the history of the hose gag in comics. And to see that it stretched back way before Lumiere made the famous film that's basically features a hose and a water hose and someone getting splashed with a water hose dates way back before Lumiere's film in 1900. And a number of scholars had really been digging around in this area before, and we were very, very fortunate that they were generous to share their research with us. But when we started digging ourselves, we came upon some things that we never would have thought existed.
And part of our madness was we were insisting on original sources for everything in the book, which was indeed madness, or as much as possibly. So after we had, sort of located a number of these things, we had to literally get high-res scans from around the world after all of these early hose gags had been tracked down.
Literally from around the world, not just Europe, but we got one from Australia.
Yeah.
And just digging and digging and digging. This book would not be possible before the internet. Finding this original source stuff. Interesting thing about finding that original newsprint was that as difficult as it was to find some of those strips printed in, say, a German humor weekly from 1870, it was just as hard or harder as we moved into the second part of the 20th century.
Yeah,
because that's all of that newsprint started to get thrown away from libraries, bound volumes that libraries would have collected in the first part of the 20th century. They were getting ditched to make room for space because everything was getting microfilmed. And it did not fit in with our MO to have anything in the book reproduced from microfilm. Although we did have to finally, there's one or two strips that were just absolutely impossible to find. I'm still searching for them today.
Yeah, those were the strips from the New York Daily Graphic, which apparently there was no hard-run copy anywhere on Earth. We know that New York Public Library refused to collect it. It was the National Enquirer of its day. And, there's a few reels of microfilm, and that's about it.
And I really appreciate that search for authenticity and everything. And then it becomes very ironic that the strip that we're seeing in the book repeated over and over and over again, assuming that you guys had to kind of reassemble. We could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I wish we had the original art for that Draw You Varmint strip, but it just doesn't exist.
Well, I'm still convinced that it's going to show up any minute now. For years, the minute the book comes out, somebody's going to put it up on Heritage.
Yeah, so once again, we get, the modern publishing is such that you really have to make everything look perfect. And because we're so obsessed by the object itself and looking deeply into the object itself, we had to treat all of the strip reproductions with the same sort of degree of reverence. And easily, Mark and I worked on fine-tuning the strips in the book for 2 full years of our lives apiece. The strips, there's a section in the back of the book that we haven't spoken about, which is basically a do-it-yourself section.
Right.
And for each of the sections in the do-it-yourself, each of the strips in the do-it-yourself sections references one of the chapters in the book. So let's say there's one about lettering, a spread in the middle about lettering. In the do-it-yourself section, there's 4 strips.
Yeah.
In which Bushmiller has used lettering in an interesting way. Once again, we're thinking about classroom use here, and this would make a great assignment. You've read about Bushmiller's lettering in spread 17 or whatever it is, go back into the back of the book, and here's 4 strips that use lettering in an interesting way, analyze them. But the strips that we used back there all came from different sources: newsprint, comic books, tear sheets, original art, and proof sheets, yeah. And so we had to make them sort of equalize them so that they all were immediately accessible.
Yeah, on the same playing field visually.
Yeah. So there's 4 years of human activity.
Rooms full of interns.
Yeah, absolutely.
And students as well.
Thank you, Mark, for saying that. We got some really first-rate computer jockeys helping us there too.
So you did use some of the students, you used interns, but you basically oversaw all of the technical aspects of the reproduction.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Mark has they look like eyeballs, but they're actually laser beams. He's really good at discerning what we would call crunchy pixels.
Crunchy pixels.
Yeah.
Well, you were talking about some of the challenges of finding the originals. Was that the biggest challenge in pulling together this book, or were there other things in addition that you found, if not confounding, then more work than you anticipated?
It's a hard question to ask. Everything was certainly more work than we anticipated. We really had this delusional walk in the park scenario that this would be something we could just knock off in our spare time. And the more we fell down at least a good dozen rabbit holes in the course of this book. It really does sort of feel like it's maybe 3 or 4 separate books that have somehow been intertwined, hopefully seamlessly in some way. But we really wanted to sort of just give a taste of the various ways that once you start looking at something that these ideas branch out. The appendixes, we could have gone on and on with those. I mean, we really had to be at a certain point just sort of cut ourselves off and just say, okay, that's it, we're done. But there were more we could have gotten in there for sure.
I really appreciated the depth of those appendices. I realized when I got to the appendix, and we still had 100+ pages to go in the book. I mean, for our readers, for our listeners, that's how thick the information is in this book. Because you'll see, you'll be reading along and it'll say, see appendix such and such on whatever, and you go there, and again, like the one about the hose gag, it's like 40 pages long or close to it. It feels like there's so much there.
At the same time, we really hope that it's your description right there makes it sound like it's kind of a dusty old, Oh
no, exactly the opposite. That made me happy to see that much extra information there.
Yeah, we really worked hard on that, to try to keep the tone light and the ball bouncing along at the same rate. I think people who we've been getting a lot of feedback about people just enjoying leafing through the book and having fun with it.
Yeah, this is
go ahead.
Start in a lot of different places. It's not necessarily best read from beginning to end, although we do recommend that. But you can jump around quite a bit and have a quality reading experience.
Yeah. And again, when you first hear about it, it's like you're focused on one single image of Nancy, one single strip from Nancy, but you get overall, once you finish reading the whole book, you've got a really good grasp of visual humor, production, consumption, dissemination, because you get into things like there's one appendix on the Ben-Day dot system.
Yeah.
For example, I mean that's fascinating, and that's something that like you say, pretty much does not exist at all anymore. And when you see it, it's always some kind of a digital recreation of it. It's almost impossible to find somebody who's actually using that stuff anymore. But you guys give a really good description of that, or offset printing, or anything like that. We've got a lot of good information in one book. Like you said, you were hoping this would be in a classroom. I don't teach anymore. I kind of wish I did now, because this looks to me to be a very teachable text, and it's not just teachable, but it's also very informative for people. But like you said, in an interesting way.
One of the things about the Ben-Day dot process, we actually got to go behind the scenes at the Smithsonian, and they had one of those original Venn contraptions. And I think she was a librarian there, and she was really surprised that anyone was interested in seeing. I don't think anyone had touched that box since like the mid '60s. She said the last open was 1965 or something like that.
I mean, luckily we're both of the right age to have had, some experience in some of these processes ourselves. I don't know that a younger set of writers could have, done this quite as easily because we both worked with, the latter version of the Ben-Day dots, which were, the sort of cut and apply Zipatone sheets.
Yeah.
And students are fascinated by this. When I show them this stuff, it's like
hand color separation.
Yeah, where can I get that?
Well, one thing I'm curious about is where your appreciation of Nancy comes from. I mean, obviously, as adults, as artists, writers, creators, you have a love and appreciation of Ernie Bushmiller. But where did each of you first approach Nancy? What are some of your earliest memories of Nancy that really caught your imagination?
I basically learned to reading Nancy. I grew up on Staten Island. It ran in the Staten Island Advance. It was a comic strip I was attracted to from a pretty early age, and always been sort of fascinated by. So it's always been with me. I think Paul came to it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, but probably at the same age we were probably looking at it because, this is back in a time when every house got newspapers. Mm-hmm. And we get one delivered in the morning. My dad would bring one home from work in the evening paper. But the morning paper ran Nancy every day. And for me, there was something just kind of strange about it. Like Aunt Fritz looked like she belonged in another strip. Mm-hmm. And these kids were and yet they all lived together. It was just something kind of, I remember just feeling a little creeped out by it too. Not to mention the fact that like on the playground at recess, it was the only strip that nobody talked about because it was so stupid. So sophisticated because we read Peanuts, So we wouldn't talk about Nancy, but I guarantee you every kid on that playground read Nancy. It was impossible not to.
I was really fascinated. There was definitely sort of an air of antiquity to it, a throwback. They were using, the cars that would go by in the strip were easily 30 years out of date. But sort of what Staten Island was like when I was a kid in the 70s, so it sort of made sense. We got Peanuts in the same newspaper on the same page, too, and I liked them both for different reasons. But I was always very attracted to them. I think something about the specificity of it, the hard edge of it. A little bit later when I came across Will Elder's work, I made a real visual connection between those two.
Yeah, for sure.
Two of my early favorite cartoonists that are still two of my favorite cartoonists.
There's something interesting that I think a lot of cartoonists of our generation share, which is this nostalgia for the first half of the 20th century, the decades even preceding our birth. I just love, Mark and I both just love old junk from the 20th century. And growing up, watching the sort of 5 o'clock movie, bad B movies, and not really understanding what they were, but loving the cars and the style and the title cards. And we both have a great affection for old animation. The older, the better. I just think it sort of comes from, I don't know.
Well, we grew up in the second half of the 20th century, which was pretty much regurgitating the first for, embers. Right. And we're still, it's still striking how much of the culture is still stuck on sort of like parsing the 20th century. Yeah. Here we are 20 years into the 21st.
Yeah.
And we're still kind of reckoning with what happened in that century.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be going on for quite some time.
Yeah.
I remember reading Nancy as a kid, and, it was in our newspaper. it didn't really have an effect on me, or at least I don't remember it having an effect on me like other strips. I mean, Peanuts, again, is the obvious example. But I didn't really think much about it. But I tell you, when I first started to think of Nancy critically, if you want to put it that way, is years later when I was reading Zippy the Pinhead, and one of the things that would come up every now and again are the three rocks. And as part of Griffith's gag, and I thought, okay, when I was younger reading Nancy, I never thought about that, and I just didn't think anything was askew about that. But then Zippy made me go back to relook at Nancy and wish that I had maybe a more mature eye or more awareness when I read that original strip, because it may have made me a more warped adult. Who knows?
It's never too late.
Yeah, you talk about like the Nanciness of Nancy, or the fenceness, the fenceness of the fence, like how the things that appear in Nancy comic strips are in Bushmiller's version are the thing. He's boiling it down to the essential things you need to see, and it's like you're looking at these aren't just kids; these are like capital K platonic ideals of children. But it's but everything in the strip is there, simple and in essence, just because it's always serving that gag.
Well put.
Yeah, and one of the things that we really did learn is how conscious Bushmiller was of that. He was very, very, insistent about wanting to do the strip this way, keeping it very, very sort of precise and crisp visually. He was critical of a lot of cartoonists that weren't, he felt were outdrawing their gags, where, there's a lot of like sort of flashy, pen work going on that sort of, stops the gag from being received as quick as possible, which was always his goal.
One of the key objects in this strip that you've described that we take apart is the water gun. And, it's Bushmiller. Imagine this thing is running in your newspaper, and it's probably less than a 1/32 of an inch big, but you immediately know it's a water gun. And he not only draws it perfectly gun-shaped, but he also makes it white. Like, immediately it's not a gun, it's a water gun, because it's made out of white plastic. And you discern this, and you don't need a magnifying glass to get it. It totally reads instantly. He's that conscious of how he is using those iconic shapes and forms to delineate specific objects.
Mm-hmm. And you even talk about how the characters aren't in their exactly normal iconic clothes, because their normal iconic clothes in one way or another for each of them, Nancy and Sluggo, would take away from the gag. You've got to realize it's them, so it's close to what they normally wear, but it's not like the polka dot skirt and the vest, because that wouldn't work when she puts the belt on, things like that. I just love that kind of attention to really, really close detail that you bring to everything in the book.
Right, and then the next day, Nancy and Sluggo are pals again, and they're back in their costumes because they don't need to have alternative costumes. The gag's about ice cream.
Yeah. But, in addition to the more formal, close reading aspect that you give to this strip, there's also the cultural context that sometimes appears in your context section, in other places in the appendix. And coming back to the gun, I hadn't even thought about it until I read in the book that a reason for making the gun in Sluggo's hand white is not only to distinguish it as a water gun, but he's doing that. Bushmiller did that within a particular historical context, because it hadn't been that many years since the congressional investigation, or the congressional hearings, 1954. So, I mean, this was something that you suggest that Bushmiller did not. He wanted to make things safe. In other words, no one would mistaken what Sluggo is doing with something other than a water gun.
Yeah, but more importantly than safe, it had to sell the gag.
Yeah.
That comes first.
All about the gag. And I wanted to say, because again, you talked about the depth of your research and things that you could have put in the book and didn't. I really, really appreciate the How to Read Nancy reading group on Facebook.
Oh.
I'm a faithful viewer and occasional contributor to that group as well. I work in a library of African studies, and we got a bunch of Italian magazines from the World War II era in, and post-war. And I found an Arturo and Arturo and Zipstrip, and I actually posted that in there also because Nancy is everywhere. But yeah. I love seeing what other people have found, and you guys adding in more details as well. For me, this is like the extra appendix for the book.
Well, more members seem to be joining every day, so welcome aboard. And anyone who's listening right now, it's the How to Read Nancy reading group on Facebook. You're free to join. It's free, and the entertainment value is high. And Gene, post some more of those Arturo and Zoe strips. We'd love seeing them. It's
okay.
It's interesting to note, just a sub-note for those who didn't read the book, is that in all the English-speaking countries, the strip is just called Nancy. But when you get over to Europe, in France and in Italy, Nancy and Sluggo were called Zoe and Artur or Arturo. And in those strips, the boy gets the top billing.
Right.
So it's just being called Nancy. It's called Artur and Zoe, or Arturo and Zoe. Cool little cultural enrichment there.
Well, you've mentioned several times coming across material that you could have included in the book, or coming up with ideas that you wish you had included in the book. Are you seriously considering a new edition to How to Read Nancy at some point?
Well, we just went into a second printing, and we were able to catch a handful of typos and smaller works, but we can see it at this point. I'm sad to say. If the interest persists, we can see places where there are things should be dropped in that maybe we left out a little too hastily.
Well, I was surprised at just how cleanly the book read. I mean, it's beautifully designed, and I saw almost no typos that I can even recall. So I mean, there's a lot of text in this book. Well, and
we were lucky to have a really crackerjack proofreader, a friend of ours named Beth Pearson, who is just a masterful, pro. And she just did a first-rate job. We were really thankful for her. This, the stuff that we just caught for the second printing is so minuscule. It's 3 dashes instead of 2, that sort of thing. It's microscopic.
Most creators that we have on the Comics Alternative for our interview series, they're about to come out with a new work that we discuss, or the work has just come out. But this is an occasion where your book has been out for several months. So one question that I have for you is, what has the reception of this book been? And then along with that, what are the kind of things that you guys have done either individually or more importantly together to help spread the news and to discuss and to form, as Gene was suggesting, reading groups and appreciation groups for this text?
Well, right now, you caught us in Richmond in a hotel room together. We're going to be speaking at Virginia VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. I've just spaced out the name, Commonwealth University, where author Tom DeHaven, is a great writer, is visit, and we did some panels. We did a book launch at the Society of Illustrators. We did an event at Comic Arts Brooklyn and Parsons School, Ben Catcher's Picture Stories Symposium. Mm-hmm. And in next weekend, we'll be in New York at the MoCA Festival, looking at Nancy strips with Patrick McDonald, who draws Mutts, and Gary Panter, and Roz Jack.
Damn. Oh, my God.
Title of that panel is Why Nancy? And they're going to tell us.
And MoCA Fest has been pretty good about filming their panels also. I used to live in Albany, so I would go to MoCA Fest a lot. But I'm in Chicago now, so it's a little harder to make it out there. But I can't wait to see that panel if they do film it. Please, please, please.
Yeah. We're in. We'd like to come out to Chicago. Maybe there's some talk about getting out there in the fall for that humanities festival.
Oh, that would be perfect.
Yeah, that would be really fun. We'd love to. I love Chicago.
Any love for Charlotte, North Carolina? No one comes here except for Heroes Con.
Talk somebody into buying us some plane tickets, and we'll be there.
Hey, I'll have to search those out. Okay, well, we wish you the best of luck in this latest leg of your, I guess you can call it publicity tour or just spreading the love of Nancy. But we really do appreciate you taking the time, Paul and Mark, for talking with us. This is really an insightful text, How to Read Nancy. And if our listeners were not aware of it before, they should definitely run out and get a copy, typo-free, now.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for having us, guys.
Yeah, thank you. I love talking to you, and I learned a lot from this book. And again, not in a dry academic way, but in a I can't wait to turn the page to see what new thing I'm going to find.
Yes,
that makes us insanely happy.
Really, thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Man, I love this book, and that was a lot of fun talking to Mark and to Paul. And I want to thank them again, even though we just did, for taking the time out. This was a travel day for them before a gig that they're doing, I think, tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So I was really thankful that they took their time out to talk with us for an hour, and I appreciated talking to them and just learning more about all the work that went into this book.
Yes. And, this is one of those occasions where I wish our podcast were more visual than auditory, because many of the things that we discuss, and especially the very heart of their book, deals with the visuals and how the various components, even really, really small components, work together to create a whole. And I think we did an okay job in describing what some of those visuals look like. But to really appreciate what Paul and Mark are doing at this book, you really do need to get a copy.
Right. Yeah. And like they said, if you're on the evil empire that is Facebook, the How to Read Nancy reading group is an essential group to join. And we try to keep it Bushmiller as much as possible. It should be Bushmiller Nancy, because that is Nancy. But you learn a lot about people are posting Nancy memorabilia or insights into the strips that they hadn't read before, or more information about Bushmiller's life. Even though there's a ton of information in the book, you get little bits and pieces there as well. It's a really fun Facebook group as well to just watch the stuff come by, and it's very participatory, and they're very active on it as well. It's not just people talking about whatever. They're in there, and they're conversing with people, and it's a fun extension class.
Yeah, so check that out on Facebook, and also check out the book itself, How to Read Nancy, The Elements of Comics in 3 Easy Panels by Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden. Came out from Fantagraphics in the fall, but you can get your copy at our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and you're going to find a whole slew of discounts every single month. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your book there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our interview with Mark and Paul. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can give us an email. We are 2 guys at comicsalternative.com. That's 2 spelled out. And I am Gene at comicsalternative.com. And Derek?
I'm Derek, interestingly enough, at comicsalternative.com.
Like it was planned that way.
Mm-hmm. You can find us all over social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
We are everywhere.
That's right.
We're everywhere you want to be.
But in a good way.
Yeah, not in a creepy way.
No, not creepy. And we will be back with more interviews in the days to come. And believe me, we have quite a number of them lined up. So check back for those. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I am Gene.
Take care.
Bye-bye.